Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to General Black. Thank you so much for joining us for today's event, Building a Better Big Tech Mousetrap, Designing the Digital Platform Commission. I'm Meredith, Whipple, Interim CEO of Public Knowledge. It's a pleasure to be with you as we explore what comes next in reining in the outside power of big tech and advancing a fairer, more competitive digital future. First, I want to offer a heartfelt thanks to General Black for this beautiful space and for providing refreshments for the reception that will follow today's program. I'm also deeply grateful to the Public Knowledge team whose tireless work made this event and the people we're launching today possible. A special thank you to Harold Feld, our Senior Vice President, Lisa McPherson in the back there, our Policy Director, for their vision and leadership in bringing forward today's report titled Building a Digital Platform Commission, How to Design a Regulator to Rein in Big Tech. There's QR codes in front of you where you can check out that paper. And deep appreciation to our Communications Director, Sheila Stella, our Communications Intern in the back there with the camera, Autumn Tells, and our Bench Manager outside, Michelle Median, for making this all run smoothly behind the scenes. This event is a culmination of a year-long initiative, and in many ways a milestone in a journey that began in 2019 when Public Knowledge first proposed the idea of a dedicated digital regulator. Since then, the problems with digital platforms have only grown more complex and more urgent. Last summer, we convened our first ever Public Knowledge Policy Conclave, also known as PKPK, where we brought together 25 leading experts in law, tech, academia, and civil society. That gathering, held under modified Chatham House rules, was an honest, creative, and challenging dialogue. Together, we explored what a sector-specific regulator could and should look like in the US, not just in theory, but in practice. The results of those conversations and the listening sessions that preceded them are in the report we launched today. It reflects an updated, thoughtful proposal to create a digital platform commission modeled as an independent expert agency with real authority to protect consumers, promote competition, and serve as a center of research and technical expertise. Because antitrust alone isn't enough. Because laws built for an analog world can't govern our digital one. And because while other nations are moving forward with proactive digital regulations, the US continues to fall behind. Today's event is an invitation to policymakers, scholars, and advocates to imagine what's next, to help build the infrastructure for a digital future where fairness, transparency, and accountability are the norm, not the exception. Before we begin, I would like to note that we've invited our participants here today to speak from their individual capacities and not on behalf of their institutions. Now, we're thrilled to begin this conversation with a keynote from someone at the forefront of legal advocacy in this space, Kathleen Bradish, Vice President and Director of Legal Advocacy at the American Antitrust Institute. Kathleen has been a leader in advancing competition policy that serves the public, and we're honored to have her with us here today. Please join me in welcoming her. Kathleen, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Meredith. It's such a pleasure to be here today to kick off the presentation of Public Knowledge's report on the Digital Platform Commission. We are undoubtedly at a very difficult moment when the very idea of government working for us seems to be under attack. But as the political philosopher Cornel West once said, echoing many others, hope is not the same as optimism. Hope is not the belief that things will automatically get better. It's the conviction that justice, no matter how improbable, is worth fighting for. The work that Harold Feld and Lisa McPherson have done in this report is part of that hope. It is an essential piece of the efforts to translate America's commercial technology success into a benefit to Americans, consumer and citizens, not to have it be a success that comes at the price of our citizens. Traditionally, we have relied on antitrust to carry that water. You all probably know the famous pair of statues called Man Controlling Trade that stand in front of the FTC building, not very far from here. They portray antitrust as a kind of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, perhaps, reining in the mythically powerful horse of trade. On one hand, the unmatched raw power of trade channeled by the skill and leadership of a regulator. One of the things I appreciate most about these statues as a work of art is that it's not really clear, looking at the statues, who's going to win. The men seem to have the upper hand for the moment, but it's clear that the balance could change at any time. And in fact, which was a bit of a surprise to me because I've never looked at them both at the same time, but as I was researching this, I found out that the two are not the same. They're similar, but not the same. They're not identical. And when you look at the Pennsylvania Avenue side statue, he seems on much firmer footing than his compatriot on the Constitution side. And who seems to be, I have to say, looking like he's going to lose his balance at any moment. So, these sculptures, which were installed in 1942, seem to have been quite prescient. Looking back from our perspective now, it seems like the sculptor Michael Lance well foresaw what the cycles of antitrust enforcement that we've seen since then. As we've moved through times of greater enforcement, lesser enforcement, and sometimes woefully inadequate enforcement. The power of big tech and its digital platforms, though, is something I don't think could have been imagined in 1942. And I don't think a sculptor today dealing with the same issue would choose the same visual. I leave it to your imagination what today's version would look like. For myself, maybe I imagine a many-tentacled kraken, or a leviathan, or maybe Hell, the villainous supercomputer from 2002: A Space Odyssey. But regardless, what's clear is that our FTC twins, perhaps in my mind Sherman and Clayton, regardless of how fit they may be, will need some help if they are going to channel this force for the good and service of all Americans. For years, we've given big tech a pass on antitrust, trusting in the power of innovation to make it all okay. I remember how often I heard the claim many years ago that we shouldn't be worried about Facebook. For example, because the rapid changes of innovation mean its dominance would be as ephemeral as that of MySpace. How wrong we were. Instead of 3 years of dominance, which we may have seen with MySpace, we have 15 years of Facebook/Meta and no end in sight. Instead of a network of 100 million monthly users, we have a network of 3 billion monthly users. Instead of a worth of $580 million at its peak for MySpace, we have a market cap for Meta that peaked a few years ago at $1 trillion. So not the same scale at all. Gradually, first in Europe and then here in the US, it began to be clear that all was not okay, and the horses were out of control. Instead of rapid change and competition, we had entrenchment. And the biggest platforms took deeper and deeper root in our daily lives. And we began to see that customers were not necessarily the beneficiaries here. Users were forced to give up their data and privacy to join these networks. The innovation of app developers and online publishers was weighed down by super competitive pricing for access to a small set of dominant platforms. And potentially revolutionary startups were acquired and rendered harmless by the incumbents. Antitrust investigations in this decade, the past few years, uncovered enough to lead to 5 different antitrust complaints for violations of the Sherman Act in this area. 2 for Google, 1 each for Meta, Apple, and Amazon. And maybe there's one in the works for Microsoft, we'll see. Complaints led to trials in now 3 of the 5 cases, and findings of liability in 2, the 2 cases against Google. It's been a huge amount of work and a significant success for DOJ and FTC in these past few years. But as we enter the remedies phase for the first few of these cases, the two Google cases, the question of whether success has come too late is front and center. Are there fixes that will, as the Supreme Court instructed long ago, pry open the markets to competition? Maybe, but they cannot be half measures. They will have to be dramatic and perhaps painful if we are to deal, and more painful than they would have been had we dealt with these issues in a timely manner. And we will never know what, with any exactitude, what we have lost as a result. What competitive landscape would have looked like if the tech giants had not been able to continue their anti-competitive practices for so long. But these prosecutions, as imperfect as they were, are far from futile. There was, in the wake of the Microsoft decision in 2001 and the DC's rejection of a breakup remedy in favor of behavioral fixes that turned out to take over a decade of judicial intervention to even remotely make them work, a whole conversation, a whole conservative strain of thought that if we couldn't come up with effective remedies, we shouldn't pursue these cases at all. Maybe not even pursue monopolization cases at all, or at least very rarely. And this idea seems to have infected how we approach the rise of Google and Meta and Apple in the years that followed. There was a kind of intuitive appeal to that logic. Why spend the money and the energy and the time of under-resourced trust agencies if the result was a partial, maybe even Pyrrhic victory that couldn't resurrect the potential competitors Microsoft had killed off, for example. But this was simply, and from today's perspective, tragically wrong. The Microsoft case and the carefully thought out opinion that the DC Circuit issued, in fact, provided the blueprint for the current digital platform cases. Without it, I think it would have been an uphill battle for DOJ to convince Judge Mehta that in the Google search case that there were Section 2 violations. And it is a cautionary tale for the remedies phase about half measures. To circle back to Cornel West's description of hope, justice, however improbable, is worth fighting for. So, with that in mind, what do the current set of digital platform cases teach us that can inform how we address the omnipresent reality of big tech and the rise of its new face, AI? First, we have the benefit of DOJ and FTC's investigations into understanding what kind of practices the digital platforms have engaged in to create the moats around their monopolies. We have seen this illustrated by vivid documentary and witness testimony in the trials that have happened in the past year. And we have benefited, I think, unsung, from the exhaustive work of economic experts, for example, on the role of behavioral economics and defaults in this space. So briefly, I think we can characterize these practices in a couple of different categories. One, buying up potential threats. We see this with WhatsApp and Instagram, or buying businesses and components of a broader ecosystem, like Google's acquisition of DoubleClick and AdMeld. Second, exploiting the behavioral advantage of defaults, locking in users and distribution channels via default status. That is largely what the Google search case is about. Then, third, using various practices to keep users inside the monopolist's ecosystem. Examples of this include self-preferencing techniques, which allow the monopolist to disadvantage competitors. We see that in ad tech, and where the rules were rigged to favor Google in ad options. And then tying and bundling, which we see both in ad tech, for example, and Amazon cases. And this is particularly important, I think, because it shows how the tentacles of monopoly can be mutually reinforcing. Google, for example, according to Judge Brinkema's opinion, used access to AdWords, which reflects its monopoly in search, in order to lock in advertisers and publishers to its ad tech products, creating another monopoly in ad tech. Third, limiting interoperability and functionality to other alternatives without justification. We see this, for example, in the Apple complaint, where the DOJ faults Apple for how they treated other smartwatches, for example, accessories, how they treated the Androids on their messaging apps, etc. And finally, the hoarding and creation of large databases that are used only by the monopolist and are inaccessible to others. So, second, I think it's possible to identify, as a result of these antitrust actions, to identify when a digital platform has market power to abuse its dominance. In all of these cases, there was a lot of doubt initially about how the market or set of competitive products would be defined. The shadow of the Supreme Court's decision in Ohio versus American Express hung over all of these cases to a large extent, and the way it had been interpreted to make it very difficult to show that a platform has market power. This was compellingly dissipated, I think, by Judge Brinkema in the Google ad tech case, and is, I think, the thing most worth reading from this opinion, which is 150 pages. So, she explained that in great detail and with good analogies, why most digital platforms are not like the credit card platforms at issue in the Amex opinion, and why we can't indulge in a modern cellophane fallacy, letting platforms define a supposedly competitive market when that market is itself a function of their own monopolistic practices. Finally, and perhaps most important, what we learn from these cases is that speed matters. The investigative and judicial processes are slow, case by case, and necessarily retrospective. To take the Google search case, for example, it was filed in 2020. It is only now in the remedies phase, and once appeals have been exhausted, it could be 2027 or 2028 before the judgment is final. The behavior at issue, like the exclusive contracts it had with Apple for default status, date from 2012 at least. So potentially we're talking about 15 years or more that Google was able to continue its anti-competitive practices. That may have been a lot even back in 1942, but that's lifetime in our current tech world. The ad tech case, as a case, has moved much more quickly. It's in the rocket docket in the Eastern District of Virginia. But some of the conduct at issue there actually dates back to Google's acquisition of ad tech in 2007. So there we're talking about 20 years of ongoing issues. As the cases roll in, we begin to see the full length and breadth of the actions that were taken to limit competition on these platforms, and the recognizable patterns of behavior we're seeing, and the challenges of remedy in cases where the conduct has gone unchallenged for a decade or more. The case for an ex-ante process becomes even stronger. These are the very reasons that Europe turned to the Digital Markets Act, for example. So today, we will hear from a great set of experts to help examine how we can set up an ex-ante process that is so needed, and how to make that process work in the United States. A final word that antitrust, with its object of channeling trade to benefit consumers and citizens, tells us what's at stake in getting the regulation of the digital platforms we all live in right. As the Supreme Court wrote in U.S. v. Topco in 1972, antitrust laws are the Magna Carta of free enterprise. They are as important to the preservation of economic freedom and our free enterprise system as the Bill of Rights is to the protection of our fundamental personal freedoms. So too here, and I am so pleased that we have this report from Harold and Lisa and such deep thinking about how to make that happen for digital platforms.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. Very thoughtful remarks. We are so appreciative of your continued leadership in competition policy, which is continuing to move the conversation forward. Now I'm excited to introduce the moderator for the next portion of the event, Justin Hendrix, CEO and editor of Technology Press. Justin is one of the most thoughtful voices at the intersection of technology and democracy. Through Technology Press, he's created a vital platform for exploring how digital technologies impact society and governance. Before founding Technology Press, Justin was executive director of NYC Media Lab, where he helped bridge the gap between media innovation and academic research. We're thrilled to have him guiding today's panel discussion. Please join me in welcoming Justin Hendrix.
You gonna switch left?
No.
Well, thank you, Meredith. I'm just here essentially to invite Harold, I believe. And I think everyone knows Harold in this room for the most part. So probably needs a little introduction, but his official bio says he's been at this more than 20 years and is Senior Vice President of Public Knowledge. Is the Sausage Factory still going?
I actually have closed that down. It ran 20 years. That seemed, a decent run for something as old as a blog these days. Someday I might bring it back.
As someone who admires blogs and wishes for that longevity, thank you for all the effort on that. And I'll turn it over to Harold now, and then we'll invite our panel up.
So, thank you. Yes. So, first, it was pointed out to me that I should probably remind folks who haven't been living with this for 5 years what we mean when we talk about digital platforms. There are a lot of technical definitions that have been given. Most of us have a sense of what's clearly in Google Search, Facebook, Amazon, what's clearly out. Walmart or corner bookstore, even if they have a website. And then there's a lot of area in between, depending on who you ask and who is doing the defining. The definition that I've been proposing is that it's a service that's accessed by the internet, that it is a two-sided platform with at least one of the sides facilitating not just content consumption, but also content creation. And content here is used very loosely. It can be the sale of goods and services. It can be reviews. It can be simple commerce. But the trick is it's a two-sided platform which has the public on one side and another entity on the other side and the platform in the middle. And that they are interactive in enough ways that there is, as the next criteria goes, that they enjoy powerful network effects, both between the sellers and buyers, but also horizontally between other buyers and other sellers or other creators and other consumers, however we want to frame it. Those, I argued in my 2019 book, The Case for the Digital Platform Act, why those criteria are, to my mind, the important criteria for digital platforms. As I say, we've seen the European Union adopt somewhat different definitions, the UK adopt somewhat, but these recommendations apply across all of the variations that we've seen, that they clearly, as I say, we know what we're talking about and we can debate the edge cases. So if I can have the timeline slide, please. I just want to very quickly go over the history of this paper. Because over the last few years, we've seen a lot of discussion around this, And we recognized that we weren't the only people thinking about this, and also people who weren't thinking about this directly, but who were stakeholders, had a lot to say about what they would like to see in such an institution and what they were afraid to see in such an institution. Not surprisingly, there is a lot of concern of, oh, what if you create an agency and it doesn't work? Facebook says they want one. Obviously, you know, they have a very different conception from what consumer advocates had. So we, you know, we spent a good deal of time doing focus groups with some of our fellow advocates to get some initial sense of what are the key issues we needed to discuss. We then had our convening of 25 experts who were from a variety of backgrounds, academic, advocates, private sector, former government, and we then you know, did our own internal development, and the report you see is the consequence of this, hopefully building on not just, you know, our own at PK expertise, which what the hell we're proud of, but you know, that of others as well. There were also a couple of things that we looked at and we said we need to narrow the issues because this is a huge set of concerns. Oftentimes when you try to wrap your arms around this, it can lead to a certain decision paralysis because there are so many different factors. We decided to take content moderation and content management off the table for purposes of this discussion. That's an area that gets a lot of discussion on its own, and it very quickly, when we did the focus groups, became the most contentious area of discussion. So we said, okay, let's just take that off the table. There are separate recommendations that Public Knowledge has made that in a series of blogs and report from my co-author Alissa McPherson and my colleague Morgan, and who I apologize for blanking in certain last name here. I'm old. Okay. But we took that off the table. We took some of the questions of the problems like privacy that are across the entire sector. They aren't limited to digital platforms. Digital platforms obviously have a great deal to do with this and about the consumption of private information and use of private information, but we felt that something that was that broad was not going to be part of our recommendations here. We're not going to try to tell you how to fix the privacy at large, although any commission that relates to digital platforms will have jurisdiction over how these entities specifically are using your personal information and what needs to be done to protect that. Finally, we decided that we were not going to let ourselves be constrained by the political economy questions, as I'd like to call them. The goal here is to provide the strongest set of recommendations. We are not blind to political realities, and we discussed those somewhat, but as others have said, we believe, if we really believe that democracy is going to survive and that we're going to have representative government, then we have to believe, one, that these problems are not going to go away, and two, that we will have the capacity to solve these problems. So the time to start planning for these is now. As I like to say, Elizabeth Warren did not wait until 2008 to write a book about how to fix the financial crisis. She had it in hand for when that crisis occurred. So we believe that this paper is timely, but obviously we believe a lot of further discussion is going to be necessary, and a lot of political action is going to be necessary to lay the groundwork for this. Next slide, please. So, first, it's important to recognize the context of what's going on here. The EU and the UK have taken different approaches to regulating digital platforms. The EU has its own set of statutes, the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Service Act statutes, I guess is kind of a loose description of what we can call these, because it is a regulatory framework for which there is simply no analog here in the United States. The EC is a body for which there is no analog here in the United States with regard to its relationships with member states, which is very different from the kind of federalism that we have now in the 21st century. So while we thought there were some interesting lessons there, we did not think that was an applicable model, and do not think that that is an applicable model here in the United States. The UK is relying a great deal on interagency coordination. We had a number of people who had been in the federal government who had very strong feelings about how interagency coordination does not work here in the United States. And as an outsider, I have to agree. For every one shining example you will find of when two agencies manage to work well together, there are a dozen of agencies that are simply not able to work together effectively, or where things start out well, but then they just go by the wayside. So we do not believe that a model that says let's amp up an existing agency like the Federal Trade Commission or the Federal Communications Commission and have other agencies coordinate with them about their particular jurisdictions can work here in the United States. We also believe that the Supreme Court's decisions in administrative law in recent years strengthen the case for creating a new agency. The reality is that between major question doctrine, which will serve as a significant brake on agencies trying to use their existing jurisdictions, however broadly they were written by Congress, for new technologies and new situations. Major question doctrine makes that much harder. Loper-Bright, which says you don't have to defer to agencies with regard to statutory interpretation, makes that much harder. The fact that if you read some of these decisions, you get language which, about agencies should stay in their lane, should not burden industry with onerous regulations. All these are value judgments that are being forced on agencies by courts, rather than the business of law, which we would think of courts being engaged in, which makes it very difficult for agencies who are being told to stay in their lane and to not, try to address new problems and new technologies without Congress's say-so. You need Congress to say so. You need Congress to be very explicit about this. And finally, as the FCC just discovered in the Fifth Circuit with the Jarkissi case, makes it very difficult for agencies that were not designed to bring cases in district courts to have jury trials for damages to actually be able to enforce their statutes. There's a lot of confusion about how this will work. But Congress can do certain things, as we get into in the paper, to meet these difficulties, to work within the system that the courts have created. But that requires basically a fresh canvas and a fresh brush, rather than trying to work with what we already have. At the same time, there was a lot of agreement that we need an agency that will fill in existing gaps, and also that it is not going to be the one agency that handles this. We need an agency that, if it does not work in a sort of coordination of enforcement, at least is able to coordinate with enforcers in the states, the jurisdictions of existing agencies such as the Federal Trade Commission, but other agencies that have jurisdiction over particular aspects of the problem as well. We also believe that there needs to be room for state action and for private rights of action, because various pieces of the political dynamic can break down. You want multiple backups for something like this. You want essentially a tentpole agency which is supporting a broad structure which ensures healthy competition and consumer protection, with a recognition that it is not a silver bullet and that there is no one single answer or single approach for the multiple and complicated problems that are presented by digital platforms today. So next slide, please. So we had the continued need for a sector-specific regulator, which Kathleen spoke about and which we've spoken about. When we look at the power and structure of a new agency, we continue to believe that a traditional independent commission, as they may or may not be allowed to exist, is the best approach for an area that is this large and this complicated and has this much impact on people's daily lives. If you look historically at what is it that prompts Congress to create general commissions, independent commissions, rather than simply sub-agencies within a broader agency, the criteria that tend to stand out most clearly are it's a very complex subject where you want an agency to be able to accumulate expertise over time, and it is a very sensitive subject so that you wouldn't want a single political actor such as the president to be able to simply command how this is going to be treated. That turns out in this day and age to be very timely. We're seeing the wisdom of that recommendation, where even though, of course, independent commissions through appointments are accountable to political authority, that's how democracy works, but a level of independence which includes a strong voice for the minority party with a different perspective has been traditionally acknowledged as critical in overseeing these important areas of our economy and where they relate to our daily lives. Even if we don't see these, Humphrey's executor, the important case, continue, nevertheless, an agency that at least attempts to incorporate different perspectives is important, we believe, particularly, again, in areas that are this sensitive. But we believe that if Humphrey's executive is upheld, that a traditional commission, even though it's being designed for a new area of the economy, should pass judicial muster. With regard to enforcement, the Jarczy case raises a lot of questions, many of which are unresolved. I'll say that Jarczy itself says that equitable relief, God knows when I was in law school, I was taught that the difference between law and equity was kind of an antique relic that you didn't encounter except in probate court. Another, now it's front and center in administrative law. But certain forms of equitable relief, such as injunctions, potentially restitutionary relief, which is designed not to punish in the way of a fine, but to restore the money that was taken unjustly to parties, is permissible. There is an undefined public rights element, which it is not clear how that plays out, but Congress should get a shot at designing this, and hopefully by the time we begin to design these, there will be a more settled law as to what exactly these categories are and how they play out. But at a minimum, we should avoid the mistake that has happened with the FCC, which now has no enforcement mechanism. Any such agency is going to have its own enforcement, going to have to be empowered to take actions to district court without waiting for the Department of Justice in order to be able to pursue appropriate fines and other remedies. We did observe that one of the things that got asked about a lot in the focus groups was about facilitating research. And this is an area where I think because in the early days, companies like Facebook were open to academic researchers, then as those researchers began to produce things that were not very complimentary of the companies, that access was cut off. So there was a lot of interest in not just how is a digital platforms commission going to stay expert, stay up on this, how are they going to be able to report out to stakeholders, but also is there a method for facilitating research by others. Who those others would be is part of the problem, because Cambridge Analytica got into Facebook as research experts. And when you start to say things like only professors or only these guys and not those guys, you start to get into some difficulty that the Supreme Court has identified in terms of viewpoint bias. But We think this is something that's important to continue the discussion on and for the agency to be able to do. There's also what we call soft power, setting standards, and other methods that are not direct regulation, things like NIST does in terms of the way it sets standards. NIST does not directly regulate anything, but its standards are important in ascertaining liability, and industry pays attention to them because of enforcement through private rights of action. We talked about risk assessment and duty of care and other common law duties which are a hot topic. The Digital Services Act relies on a risk assessment model that's used in financial regulation. There's also been a lot of discussion, it was in ADPA, for example, of creating fiduciary duties. And people kind of instinctively like this because it's common law stuff, and therefore there's comfort in the familiar. But we recommend against that precisely because it comes with a lot of baggage. I mean, the common law comes with 500 years or so of baggage in it. Fiduciary duties come with an awful lot of baggage that the courts have indicated if you call something a fiduciary duty, we're going to treat it as a common law fiduciary duty, whether that was your intent or not. We actually recommend against this kind of approach as not really being effective in this context, but we need to acknowledge that it's out there and a lot of people do like it, and we'll see how the European Union does with it. Finally, we looked at artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is the bright, shiny object. You can't have a conference without talking about artificial intelligence, so whoever's keeping track of these things, we're talking about artificial intelligence, we're good to go. Part of the problem here, of course, is that AI is a really broad category. Terms that used to be precise scientific terms, such as generative AI, no longer have any real meaning. Other than it's neat and you should invest in me. It is impossible to separate out the use of artificial intelligence tools in the digital platform space, especially as you have things like ChatGPT or Gemini or others that are saying, we're now the platform, use us. Well, okay, if you're the platform, you're clearly should be regulated as the platform. The AI should not be a get out of regulation free card. At the same time, the fact that people are internally trying to use artificial intelligence for things like how do I improve the efficiency of wireless networks by predicting the appropriate reflective paths in a mixed environment, that really is not the kind of thing that we're talking about as being necessary to regulate in an agency that's designed to make sure that public-facing enterprises serve the public interest. So, falling back on history and noting that initially telephone and telegraph were put in the Interstate Commerce Commission for want of any better place to put it until we finally developed the Federal Communications Commission. We believe that there's a role here for the Digital Platform Commission with regard to artificial intelligence. Certainly it should serve as a center of expertise. It may serve as a place to house whatever initial legislation we start to develop if we move out of, move to some place where we talk about putting law into these responsibilities. At the same time, we should be careful that we don't intend this to be the place that handles all things AI, even when they are not public-facing, even when they are tools of research which really don't have anything to do with what this agency would be designed for. So those are our recommendations. I thank you very much, and I welcome the upcoming critiques from the panel.
Harold, do you have a couple questions before we move to the panel?
One or two, because I do want to make sure that the panelists have time, but if there's...
Anybody, just a quick question before we move on? Anybody, there are several people in the room that are cited in this paper. I see Mark McCarthy there, for instance, others who are cited in it.
Don't cheat, because we had some of the people who were at the conclave here, so because one of them could not have a convening of experts without Mark. So.
Xander?
I guess, do you you see any potential for adapting these recommendations for state level agencies? I guess you have like the California Privacy Protection Agency, so I'm curious if you have any thoughts.
I think that state level agencies play an important part. I think one of the things that we are seeing now as the federal government has ceded responsibility in so many areas like privacy, like the regulation of broadband, that we are seeing states step up, that some of those experiments will be more successful than others. I do think that states face a lot of resource problems. It's tough enough for federal antitrust lawyers to take on Google and Amazon and Apple. Asking state regulators to take on multi-billion-dollar international companies is tough. But they will clearly play a role, and the expansion of these agencies will hopefully provide valuable lesson and instruction for any federal efforts.
One more? Yeah, back in the back.
Yeah, hey.
I'm going to ask folks to introduce themselves, Phil.
Hi, I'm Philip Ehrenbrook. I used to work for Harold Wickingham. Quick question. So in the paper, you mentioned potential rulemaking authority, and then enforcement powers. You might have penalties like disgorgement or injunctive relief or fines, other remedies. You don't mention breakups. Wanted as an antitrust person, we just heard from an antitrust person. What sort of authority do you imagine this agency having in that space?
Well, I'm going to refer folks to the chapter of the Case for the Digital Platform Act that has an entire chapter that talks about interoperability, breakups, all of these potential remedies. We did not forget about discussing the need for pro-competitive remedies. One of the advantages of an agency over antitrust enforcement is it can be used to create affirmative, pro-competitive regulations rather than simply remedying the harm after it occurs. So we PK would certainly like to see the agency empowered with remedies up to and including the ability to break up giant industries. I think is a practical level. It would be like the AT&T breakup, where we would expect to see the antitrust enforcers and the regulator work hand in hand to ensure that these things go smoothly. But certainly with the separating lines of business, rules against self-dealing, rules governing interoperability, all of these things that an agency is actually better at doing than an antitrust enforcer, because the agency is designed to be in it for the long term, designed to provide the necessary oversight and hopefully to provide necessary tweaks and adaptation as circumstances change.
Great. Harold, thank you. We'll give a round of applause to Harold and also to Alissa. I think that unfortunately I'll have to subject you to peer review. So we're going to invite our panel, I suppose, to come up next. I believe that's next. And so as they come along, I'm going to go ahead and introduce them quickly. We've got Alissa Cooper, who is the Executive Director of the Knight-Georgetown Institute, which I think we can still say is a new center at Georgetown University that connects independent research with technology policy and design. Alissa's had a number of different leadership roles in policy and industry, including at the Internet Engineering Task Force, and it's on the board now at Tor Project, Internet Architecture Board. Spent a decade at Cisco before that. Prem Trivedi, Policy Director of New America's Open Technology Institute, just to Alissa's right, your left, I suppose, from that seat. Leads OTI's research and advocacy efforts. Also non-resident senior fellow at American University's Tech Law and Security Program and teaching at Georgetown's Walsh School of Foreign Service. Then adjacent to Prem is Anna Lenhart, who is a policy fellow at Democracy and Politics at the George Washington University. Previously, just recently, senior advisor at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and also a technology policy advisor at the U.S. House of Representatives, including where she worked on some legislation that I think is very relevant to perhaps bring up and discuss today. Then, last but not least, Ramesh Nagarajan, who is counsel to the Senate Commerce Committee, Telecommunications and Media Subcommittee in the minority. He was chief legal advisor and legal advisor to FCC Chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel. I suppose has been busy in general at the FCC, where he's in the Wireline Competition Bureau, Deputy Division Chief of the Competition Policy Division. So welcome to all four of these panelists. And I believe we're going to give each of you a bit of time to kind of explain what you regard as your kind of takeaways and responses to the paper that's been put in front of you. And once we've gone through the panel, essentially offering their responses, we'll then engage in a little bit of back and forth, and perhaps also with Harold. And so I believe we're in order, right? Well, also we start all the way at the end. So Ramesh, I'm going to send you this microphone down. There's the second one. Yeah, I'll keep that one. Make sure you switch it on there.
Correct.
We can indeed hear you. So your time has begun.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much for inviting me. Thank you to Harold for such an interesting, provocative paper. Thanks to PK for hosting this meeting, and to Jenner and Block, of course. So I think I was invited because of my experience at the FCC, which I think Harold's mentioned is one of the, Harold and Alissa mentioned is one of the models for the proposed DPC. A reminder that I'm speaking in my personal capacity, not on behalf of the ranking member or anyone in the Senate. In terms of, I guess, coming from spending the last 8 years at the FCC, both in the Wireline Competition Bureau and also the last 4 years working for the chairwoman, I see a lot of merit in the idea of a sector-specific regulator to deal with the problems that big tech poses. I think just to talk about a few of the clear advantages in my mind. So the first one is the nimbleness that the regulator has. I think this goes to a lot of what the keynote talked about. An agency can be faster. An agency is not fast necessarily, but it can be a lot faster with rulemaking in particular. It can look ex ante. It doesn't have to always look ex post. It doesn't always have to look back. And it can develop a degree of expertise that comes from an agency that focuses on a specific sector. The second I think, major positive is that it has a broader purview than antitrust. So at the FCC, as Harold, I think, mentioned and alluded to, the agency engages in a lot of actions that seek to promote competition in the communications sector that go beyond traditional antitrust. So, for example, some of these things that have clear analogs in big tech. So, data portability is one of the things that Harold talks about in the 2019 book. The FCC has this history of number portability, and so previously it was difficult to switch your telecommunications carrier because you couldn't bring your telephone number. FCC rules ensured that could happen, and that led to more switching in that sector. Interconnection, open APIs, again, there's a lot of clear analogs between that and some of the work the FCC has done to open up wireline networks. Unbundling, FCC has attempted to do a lot in the unbundling area. Success, has not necessarily always been there, but again, the general idea that you have a broader set of remedies that are available if you go through the agency, I think that rings true to me. And then certainly ideas about non-discrimination and common carriage, a lot of those, the FCC has a long history of doing that, and again, the platform does. So I think those are some of the reasons where I think a TPC would make a lot of sense, and there's a good analog in the FCC. On the other side, I would say I think there are some concerns. One is capture. So I think just one of the issues, if you create a sector-specific agency, it will be looking at that sector, right? And so it will be the staff of that agency will be focused on that sector. And so, to me, this specifically raises a concern in the context of AI, as you mentioned at the end of the paper or the end of the discussion. So, I just don't know. I think it's something. It would just be in creating a new agency. If you get a group of people who think of platforms as a problem, big tech as a problem, that could be a benefit or a drawback, right, in terms of where the agency goes. So I think when we think of capture, we usually think of it as the industry itself, gets its way at the agency, and maybe that would be the case, maybe it wouldn't be, but you could also imagine the opposite happening, right, that people are focused on a mission that may or may not make sense as technology, as platforms change. The second, and I think related point, is the idea that an agency could favor incumbents in ways that are, maybe slightly separate from capture but related. So I think Harold actually does talk about these in his 2019 book. The FCC, for a long time, arguably delayed the rollout of TV because it was focused on regulating radio. The FCC, it took antitrust in some ways to push, while the FCC was focused on regulating AT&T to advance a range of public interest goals in the second half of the 20th century, it took antitrust to take the next step and to go after the section board charge. So I think this also goes to the question that Phil said that, breakups. If you're looking, if the answer is something more radical, is a sector-specific agency the right place to go? And that's a real question in my mind. The third one, I think the elephant in the room, is the climate for regulation in today's world, right? So I take the point on political economy. I think we obviously, this is the forward-looking paper, and we should be thinking about building what comes next. That being said, I do think the administrative law issues are very real. So I wholly take the point, and I think you're right, Harold and Alissa, to say that in a post-Loebert, right, post-major questions world, better to create a new agency than to go to expand the FCC's authority, FTC's authority, whoever. But that requires Congress to be very, very exacting and precise, I think, in writing this new act. And I think it's just that's just a tough challenge. I don't know that I have an answer there, but I think the new administrative law landscape is something we have to just all be mindful of. And I just think, as someone coming out of the FCC, there's just a degree of skepticism in the courts to agency action right now. And I don't really, and I think it goes beyond, a good example, as Harold knows very well, is the Sixth Circuit recently validated the prior FCC's attempts to regulate broadband as a telecommunications service. Even though I think, the plain reading of the statute is, it should be. But the court refused to get to that point for, I think, fundamentally because the winds of administrative law are narrow agency, reading agency jurisdiction narrowly, reading agency authority narrowly, and so we just have to think about that as we're moving forward. The second point, the Cherkesy point, again, wholly agree with Harold that the FCC, other agencies are going to have to change their current practices, but that is again something we have to think about in developing what comes next. And the third point I think is agency independence. I don't know where that goes. I guess the DC Circuit has overturned the district court case and so that area of the law is changing. Supreme Court will certainly weigh in soon, but to the extent that the FCC's success has been, FTC, FCC, SEC success has been on a long history of the give and take between a minority and a majority with, I think, a greater degree of certainty to industry than you might get from a cabinet department that is maybe more likely to flip back and forth. With that under attack, that is something, it's just a caution for what comes next. That being said, I do think, in my personal opinion at least, to the points that Harold raised, the points that were raised in the keynote, so many of these issues are issues that antitrust law or, which is probably the only other thing that's on offer, or another agency kind of taking your jurisdiction, while in my mind, a DPC is superior to those alternatives. I do think there are real questions, because I think it's the only one that is able to take a broader view. It's the only one that's able to look at values that are beyond those expressed in antitrust laws. I just think we should do so with keeping all the the constraints about the political economy, but also agency process in mind. But again, thought that was a great paper and look forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Next up is Anna.
All right, thanks everyone. So in DC, we have a tendency to label people as privacy scholars, director of AI policy, antitrust. And after years of working on legislative proposals to regulate the digital markets and working on and understanding the cross-border implications of the EU's Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, AI Act, GDPR, it's become increasingly clear to me that there is no way to just work on privacy, just work on online safety, just work on competition. The pillars and goals of these policy areas in the digital markets intersect. So I'm just going to give one example. Europe is implementing the Digital Services Act, Article 40 right now, which requires very large online platforms to share data with researchers to study systemic risks. Just considered an online safety bill, if you will. And regulators right now are working to clarify how that data access can comply with GDPR, because there's a lot of personal information. They are also asking hard questions about who is a researcher. Can a researcher be funded by a very large online platform? If so, does that impact competition? I have come across so many examples of these intersections, and so what has become clear to me is that to regulate the digital market, you need a well-staffed agency that can issue nuanced rules that can thoughtfully balance tensions in these values. And relatedly, not only do I think it's hard to separate privacy from competition, at least with a clear line, I also think it's difficult to differentiate subtypes of digital services. So this is where I'm gonna really go from the paper. So this is what we're seeing state legislators do. They're trying to articulate a subset of social media or generative AI in the health space, and they're trying to regulate that. The public knowledge report waffles on whether generative AI tools should be included in digital markets. My response is that generative AI tools are most certainly part of the digital market. They share the same data centers and infrastructure. They process the same personal data. They pose a risk to our information environment. I've been following the EU's conversation just this week on whether ChatGPT is a search engine. And I think it's actually like a really interesting conversation. So from a user's perspective, a user can enter a query into the TikTok For You page. They can put it in Google PageRank. They can put it in ChatGPT. All of those are AI systems, despite what the marketing professionals might have you believe. Two are ad-based for now. The privacy issues are similar, but if I'm a regulator and thinking about user controls, those are going to look a little different. If I'm thinking about researcher access, the data I want researchers to have access for ChatGPT to study systemic risks, quite different data sets. So whether ChatGPT is subject to the same laws as a search engine depends on the rules you're enforcing. So I want an expert agency that's thinking about all the intersections of those spaces. So I'm thinking broad goals and values in terms of competition, privacy, online safety, but also broad definition of online services. This is probably where I vary from the paper a little bit. So of course, the challenge with a broad scope is going to be the jurisdictional issues, which came up in the paper. And I think this came up in the paper as well, is that digital markets are already overseen by laws in healthcare, education, housing. So when I think of an agency in this space, I actually just assume it is going to operate as a hub and spoke. And I take the point that we have not done that particularly well in the United States. But I think, I just can't imagine it working any other way. So I think now actually is the time to ask, how do you get hub and spoke to work in what has traditionally been a siloed government? And particularly I think why this is important is because we do have to be efficient, and I know it's a hot word right now, but efficient and effective in the way we maximize expertise within government, because we are going to be competing for technical expertise with the private sector, so we have to be able to use it efficiently. So let's just use automobiles as an example. Automobiles have an operating system. Sometimes it's an Apple or Android operating system. They collect highly sensitive personal data. They include AI systems. I think these are topics that should be within the bounds of a digital markets regulator. But I think we all recognize that the Department of Transportation and NHTSA are the experts in traffic systems, in driver behavior, in crash testing. So when there are consumer harms from the vehicle, you can imagine experts from both agencies being involved in investigations. And the PK report did bring up that there have been some benefits to multiple agencies sharing jurisdictions. I think FTC and DOJ on antitrust, we're having some wins right now. And they're able to kind of be a check on each other, which I think is an interesting way to think about this. But we can't just have like government agencies checking government agencies. We really have to think about an ecosystem approach to oversight and accountability. So for the next few minutes, I'm actually going to talk about a project that ran in parallel to PK's conclave. And this was AI Now Institute. They brought together a bunch of experts in the Food and Drug Administration with experts in AI risk assessment. And they considered the concept of an FDA for AI. And we were really focused on the pharmaceutical drug approval part of the FDA. There's a lot of interesting things in that report. I do encourage everyone to check it out. But I'm just going to talk about one of my main takeaways, which was the FDA experts in the room said, you think of the FDA as pre-market approval for drugs. But what it is actually is an information generation machine. The FDA oversees a series of disclosures, reporting mechanisms that have made an otherwise opaque and powerful industry visible not only to regulators, but to insurers, to doctors, to patients, to researchers, and to journalists. And they've really taken an ecosystem of actors that can be a check on both drug manufacturers, but also, frankly, on the FDA itself, which in its heyday was a very powerful regulator. So a few examples of these disclosures. One you all know and love, which is the list of side effects on your favorite pharmaceutical drug commercials. But if you've ever gone to the pharmacy and picked up a drug, you get that whole packet of information. That is actually really important for people who are taking multiple drugs and for doctors. There's also clinicaltrials.gov, which houses data directly from drug companies. FDA staff publish detailed pre- and post-market studies of drugs looking not only at safety, so is the drug causing harm to patients, but also efficacy. Does the drug solve the problem it claims to solve? Can you imagine if we did that for online services? The FDA also oversees adverse event reporting systems. So this requires drug manufacturers to report serious and unexpected adverse reactions to the FDA. So it's like an incident database. And I think the main point here is you've seen Congress do transparency mandates or propose transparency mandates for the digital markets. But this is not just one transparency mandate, it's a series that are working together. I think that's really important. Besides disclosures, the FDA has advisory councils, which contribute to this information machine. So these advisory committees include physician scientists, industry experts, consumer advocacy groups. They can comment on drug approval, but they also can make recommendations for additional studies or label changes. The recommendations are non-binding, but when there is a strong disagreement between the advisories and the FDA, it triggers a public debate. So we saw this with Aduhelm, the Alzheimer's drug, a few years ago. So again, it's an ecosystem of oversight and a check on government power. The FDA also has patient representatives who provide input to the FDA staff. So in the digital market, I would argue we don't have like a perfect equivalent to patient, but we do have, we should think about ways to engage users. We should think about ways to engage individuals and communities that may not be users, but can be harmed by AI systems and market abuse. Sometimes disclosures and reporting get labeled as soft, and this kind of came up in the report as well, and I've certainly been accused of advocating for soft regulation. But I think the other big takeaway I had from the FDA experts, who were in the room with technology industry experts, was that if the technology industry had to do disclosures the way pharmaceutical companies do, they would actually have to change their internal practices. They would have to change the way they track data, update their data dictionaries, the way their trust and safety teams work with their product teams. All of that would have to change to comply with the documentation. And that's system level change. It's not content based, it's systemic. So I was really happy to see similar ideas in the PK report around the importance of researcher access, code of conducts informed by outside bodies, need to do good thorough research and put that out to the public. And I think this ecosystem approach and looking at the FDA and getting learnings would be really helpful for fleshing that out even more. Okay, so I'm gonna close with one of the reasons I think the ecosystem approach is so important is because in digital markets, we're making really hard normative decisions. And one of those is around speech and free expression. The PK report was a little hand-wavy about challenges on speech issues. It came as a concern, and I understand. But right now, our federal institutions are being gutted. Our country is experiencing rapid democratic backsliding. And the movement in power was able to rise to power under the notion that they are the party of free speech. And they've been able to maintain that brand while silencing researchers, deporting college protesters, banning books, censoring law firms, and threatening nonprofit advocates' funding sources and tax status. And yet, they are still the party of free expression. It persists because the leaders of the MAGA movement have labeled any attempt at transparency into the digital markets as censorship, whether it's a scholarly report or Europe's transparency laws. And I have not had one but two pieces of legislation I've worked on referred to as, and I quote, an effort to create a ministry of truth. One was for a proposal to mandate transparency and researcher access into online platforms. The other was related to interoperability and portability of data in digital markets. It was a competition law. So believe me when I say that any attempt to create a new digital regulator in this space will be labeled a ministry of truth, or something different if Harry Potter goes out of style. As a coalition, we are going to have to be able to put back on this narrative. And waving our hands or carving out social media platforms is not going to work. The vast majority of AI systems are designed with content moderation practices. Generative AI tools curate data sets, including posts from social media. They label those posts. They decide which content gets weighted, which prompts get through. These issues are not going away. Now is a good time to make the case for a thoughtful series of disclosures, researcher access, risk assessments, independent auditing that are designed to provide insights into online platforms, including fundamentally any preferences platforms may have for certain ideologies. And those insights need to not just be for the agency, the new regulator, but also for an ecosystem of actors. These provisions need to be written in a way that aims for intermediary scrutiny under the court's First Amendment precedent. We also need to clearly say that this new regulator, under no circumstance, needs to have a duty of care for legal speech like cyberbullying or disinformation. Getting out of this dark moment in our nation's history is going to require leaders who can make the case that the market power of billionaire-led technology companies must be curbed to enable competition and innovation, that consumers deserve privacy, protections, and autonomy, and that we can mitigate harms while protecting free expression. I'm just quickly going to close with the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics at George Washington, where I'm working. We're going to be hosting a series of workshops for recent civil servants to dive in and do some design thinking exercises around some of these really hard processes that regulators have to figure out, which were already mentioned and will be mentioned. Things like interagency processes, adaptable rules and guidelines that respond quickly to the market, and hard normative decisions. So please check out our website if you're interested.
Prem. Thanks, Justin. And thanks very much to Public Knowledge for the invitation to join this discussion, especially to Harold and Lisa for taking on the next chapter and work that Harold has long championed. As Justin noted and others, I'm speaking in my individual capacity, and interesting though, OTI hasn't taken a public position on the need, to my knowledge, for a DPC-esque regulator. And so, I'm just talking as someone who's genuinely compelled by aspects of the proposal and doubtful and concerned about others. And I will largely try in these remarks to assume a world in which we might be moving towards something akin to the DPC they propose, and to offer some suggestions about key considerations, as well as important priorities that I think we can't afford to lose sight of just because there's momentum towards something like a DPC. I should start at the outset by saying I really appreciate the long-term focus. The proposal itself is the kind of ambitious thinking we should celebrate, even if we disagree on matters small or bigger. Focused on the urgent problems of today, as we rightly are, but we can't give into a temptation, I think, to reject big picture thinking out of a hopeless sense, right, and become paralyzed by what's currently possible or impossible. And I think Harold said in his 2019 book, and I'm paraphrasing here, Harold, the fundamental goal is not just to think about what we can build with the tools that we have on the shelf, but what we need to build is informed by our fundamental values. So in that spirit, right, even as I'm thinking through the proposal today and going forward, I'm going to resoundingly endorse that spirit of thinking about governance reform. I think overall, what I want to talk about today, sort of look through long term, what are some of the advantages, as others have covered, of something like a DPC, what are the key pain points that would have to be resolved, and thinking through architecture, but I also want to emphasize what critical gaps, especially around privacy and AI, or algorithmic fairness and accountability a little more precisely, we can't afford to lose sight of. Because what I foresee, thinking long term, is that the energy required to push towards something like the DPC will lead some lawmakers, some members in the interested public, to assume that this will solve all problems of power and data. And I think that's a real risk and obviously a misunderstanding of the way that the digital platform sector is being defined by Harold, so I think it's worth mentioning that. So just quickly on that point, right, and Harold said a little bit about this, what's in and what's out, the three-part definition that Harold provided, the key one I think being the second and third, right, so it's an online service that you access via the internet, but it's a two-sided or multi-sided platform where there's an interactive component beyond just passive content consumption. So chatbots like Gemini and ChatGPT, I understood actually to be in scope, maybe Harold can clarify this later, but importantly, a broader class of predictive AI players, so think about companies building models to help insurance companies conduct analysis and make consequential decisions. Think about employers using models to analyze their employees and design performance evaluation systems. Unless this has somehow got a user-facing interactive component, which many will not, this is not going to be in scope. And in the generative AI sort of hype cycle, the class of predictive algorithms that I think many folks in society and academia have been focused on for a long time are getting lost, and I don't want them to get lost if there's momentum towards something like a DPC. At a minimum, right, as we think through different agencies operating alongside and in concert with the DPC, it suggests plenty of scope, an important scope for the agency like the FTC to play a massive and urgently needed role on privacy and on AI in the context of data misuse, deceptive practices, consumer harm. So with all that said, and somewhat relatedly, some of the biggest concerns I have, I think Ramesh has touched on a bit, which are the effect that a DPC would have on interagency coordination, the likelihood of competition among agencies, and the ultimate effectiveness. And this is obviously a subject Harold and Alissa have anticipated and with which the conclave participants have engaged in a lot of detail. This is not new. I think it just merits emphasis. My sense, and it's anecdotal, unlike I think what some of Alissa will offer you later, which is grounded in her research, agencies with overlapping powers, as a minimum, this new DPC and the FTC would share, don't automatically or naturally operate well in concert. Even though, as Harold noted, right, we do have some important examples of FTC and FCC MOUs producing reasonably effective cooperation on privacy. But as I think about it, the nature of the DPC, even scoped and understood properly with respect to digital platforms, would so fundamentally intersect with what the FTC does now that this poses a significant challenge that bears some further discussion. And again, my hobby horse, so you'll pardon it, but I want to emphasize a world in which we even have an empowered DPC is not a world in which we can stop worrying about the need to clarify and augment the FTC's power in privacy and cybersecurity, both of which are now massive question marks. Right? Quick notes on the functional powers of the DPC on independence. I vitally agree that this is incredibly important, so agree with Ramesh's point about the challenges therein. And I think he covered, and Harold and Alissa covered regulatory capture as an important question. I think even more important to my mind is insulation from the executive with whatever tools we have at that disposal, right? So even if Humphreys stands, and even in a more sanguine world we can envision in the future, some measures of exerting executive influence in unofficial ways as well as official ways, right, have been normalized. And so even in relatively normal times, I think consolidated power is dangerous, but if you have an empowered regulator with broad competence in multiple areas and broad powers, that's a valuable tool for an administration, whether this or any other interested in maximizing its own power. So I'm all for empowering expert agencies, but I also think we need to reckon with the other side of executive compulsion from above. Just running the gamut quickly, I think Anna and Harold and Alissa have talked about the importance of research and expertise, particularly as kind of cross-sectoral, cross-issue expertise, which reflects the reality in which digital platforms and some other companies work. We'll leave sort of researcher access to data questions for separately if those come up in greater detail. I think on the question of standard setting, risk assessment, mitigation, investment, you sort of go through this tier of powers that the DPC could have. And even if you imagine a future world in which there's sort of a legislative push, round 3, right, in terms of a legislative proposal akin to the DPC, and investigation enforcement powers are on the chopping block in horse trading. That's too far, that's too much. But one thing I think their paper makes a point that's really worth underlining is subpoena power and access to information is not merely in service of investigation and enforcement. It's also in service of research and expertise, right? And having worked at an independent bipartisan oversight agency, not a regulatory agency, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, and that was tasked with getting information from within government, from the interagency, I know well what the lack of independent subpoena power means for the ability to get timely information or sometimes to get information at all. I'll leave aside some of the Loper Bright stuff. I agree the analysis is helpful, but I'm also not totally persuaded by the idea that it's politically more feasible to stand up an entirely new agency with expansive powers, but not to think, if we're being sort of bold and forward-thinking, also about explicitly clarifying the scope of powers at a place like the FTC, and the FCC on privacy. So I think it's worth talking about that. A quick note, so in terms of the issue areas, I think lots of participants have covered the importance of this kind of intersectional, amalgamated expertise in competition, the ex-ante analysis, the call to not merely protect but also to promote competition. I think those are compelling arguments. But let me linger a second on content moderation and addressing harmful speech, which I know, Harold, I heard you loud and clear, have been exempted for now sort of from this discussion, but which I do think will absolutely come up in any legislative proposal of this sort, right? And I would encourage treading very lightly. We have seen this administration, as Anna pointed out, casually invoke the First Amendment and then purport to defend it and then act in ways that are obviously wildly inconsistent with that pledge. I don't think that should produce eternal timidity on the subject of content moderation, but it is a reminder of how much the executive can do to police speech, even within seemingly narrow bounds. So I don't feel prepared to think about specific speech restrictions. If I recall the book correctly, and apologies if I get it wrong, there was sort of a focus on a narrow class of harassment and things like that, which could be explicitly prohibited. Sounds great in some contexts. I am not comfortable with treading that ground now, but would certainly be interested in what DPC that would have some set of transparency rules related to speech on platforms. But in terms of actual ability to curtail speech via platforms, I think that, again, is a gift to an executive motivated to use it that could have huge consequences. Again, I think this probably came up in a conclave, so I'm not saying anything you haven't thought of. Lastly, and I'll move quickly, I think privacy and AI have to be addressed together. I mean, to my mind, AI is in the evolutionary chain of what we used to call, I don't know how long ago, big data, right? And then we've got this long period in which civil society advocates and academics who were concerned talked about algorithmic fairness and accountability. That's still where I am and where I think is really important to focus. And so again, this is not to throw any shade at the proposal, which is very, very ambitious, but to say there are also other ambitious things that need focus, right? I don't really think it's fair to say generative AI and algorithmic use that has a user-facing sort of front are going to be more consequential than the predictive algorithms that I talked about that largely operate with even more opacity, right? And just not that detectable because they're not consumer engagement tools. That requires continued attention, and even if this DPC is around and well and operating as it should be, that issue is going to be uncovered unless the FTC has a vital role to play there on privacy and fairness issues. So I wouldn't want to foster a false sense that privacy and AI would be fully covered with something that sounds as impressive, and it would be impressive, a digital platform commission for operating this way. You've got to address other known weaknesses and gaps in agency authority. I just have to say, I think in ways that absolutely defy common sense and an ethos of consumer protection, the FTC's authority to issue rulemaking and conduct enforcement on privacy and cybersecurity issues have been persistently questioned by some Republicans, right? And a DPC empowered on privacy is not going to get rid of the need to very explicitly clarify, because of this discussion of what would fall in a DPC and what would fall out. Right? Digital platforms are a subset and not a fully intersecting set of powerful companies where cybersecurity and privacy rules gravely matter. So I'll wrap it there and just sort of end by saying again, really appreciate the thoughtfulness of this paper, the proceedings, the conclave that preceded it, and of course the paper. I think we need bold and long-term thinking, and my call is just to have that also in these complementary areas that I think will fall further into the shadows if a bunch of attention goes forward on the DPC. Not a reason not to consider it, shape the proposal, but we need to do multiple sort of avenues of bold thinking at once.
Thank you, Prem. Alissa.
Thank you. The task of the final panelist to try and say something that hasn't been said. I'm Alissa Cooper. I'm the executive director of the Knight-Georgetown Institute, KGI, which is, I start to say, a relatively new center at Georgetown University dedicated to connecting independent research with technology policy and design. Lately, we've been doing a lot of analysis of some of the European regulations and what we can learn and how they might apply in context in the US, including the DMA and the DSA. So I'll talk a little bit about those today, but very happy to speak in my individual capacity. I will say I really appreciate Harold and Lisa and team at PK, your instinct to look outside the four walls of your own organization to try to develop the intellectual foundation for this proposal that feels extremely vital for a topic as weighty as this one, but also one where a real diversity of perspectives feels like it could inform and strengthen the proposal. So I really appreciate that, and I'm really glad to have the opportunity to talk about it today. Where I'm going to start is just, I'm going to be, I think, a little bit at a higher level than some of the other speakers who came before me in some ways. When I look at some of the kind of the premises and the concepts that were considered, I think, in the focus group and in the discussions that led to the publication of the paper, some of them were deemed, some of the concepts I think deemed sort of implausibly difficult to change, or barriers that you just couldn't move out of the way, and so we put them to the side. Interagency coordination was cited as one of those. And to my eye, it's not clear to me that they are necessarily more implausible than the things that the paper does propose at the current moment. For example, Prem said many of the things I plan to say. Congress having the political will to pass a detailed, nuanced, and yet sweeping law that regulates technology companies. When have we seen that happen? In our lifetimes? I'm not sure, right? So to me, I sort of look at these things, and it was hard for me to discern which ones I should consider in my spectrum of plausibility versus implausibility. And that's actually, to me, is very freeing when we think about this topic, because if I think about, I can imagine a world a generation or two from now when many of the institutional constraints or requirements that we feel so pressing today, we've just been talking about recent Supreme Court decisions and administrative law considerations of this moment. We can imagine in a generation or two that some of those will have changed significantly, just as they have in the past generation or two. And so that's kind of the space that my head went to when reading this, which, as I said, I think is kind of freeing, because then we can think really about how could we design this thing to be most effective. So what I'm going to do today is provide a few sort of additional ideas, sources of inspiration for how this proposal could be further developed, especially given that I feel like we probably have some time to do that. And those will be broken down into 4 topics. I'm going to talk a little bit about just grounding in sort of empirical scholarship of regulation. I'm going to talk about the value of comparative cross-jurisdictional analysis. I'm going to provide some sources of inspiration that I've encountered recently, but that get really specific about some of the ideas around the powers that a new regulator could have. And then I am going to touch a little bit on some of the present moment considerations, AI and antitrust. So starting with the empirical scholarship, one thing I would love to see as these ideas develop further, I guess give the context of this. Obviously, I work at a university, and we think a lot about how research can be brought to bear to inform technology policy. That's what we're all about. And in particular, we're trying to kind of draw inspiration across different disciplines and think how can we take different viewpoints, different approaches methodologically to research that can then be brought into the policy realm. And so when reading this paper, what it really brought to mind for me was some of the foundational and I believe ongoing work in both political science and political economy that tries to empirically study the effectiveness of regulators. And luckily, there are a lot of regulators all around the world. There aren't that many digital regulators, like native digital regulators, but there are a lot of regulatory agencies and 100 or more years in some countries of experience with different structures for how these bodies can be set up, what makes them more effective, how they relate to the political system on the ground, all across the world. And so I was really sort of taken back to some of those that foundational work, people like Fabrizio Gilardi, a really nice Swiss political scientist who's done comparative work and analysis around delegation and credibility, like what makes agency decisions credible. We've talked a lot about independence, and I remember work from Chris Henretti and Christelle Koop looking at independence across different regulators, doing a sort of comparative analysis, and also looking at the difference between formal independence, grants of independence, and kind of informal, how agencies develop informal independence. So I would just urge folks to kind of think broadly as these ideas develop, what can we learn from empirical political science and studies of what has made regulatory agencies more effective overall. Those are sort of historical examples. Obviously, we have lots of current scholars who are making this part of their work. And Ganesh Sitaraman, many of you know, has done some work on this in the EU. Giorgio Monti and Alessandra Destreel have a whole line of work kind of analyzing the institutional structures in the European Union and how that's affecting the implementation of the DMA and the DSA. And really trying to gather empirical evidence either from looking at the regulatory outcomes or from interviewing stakeholders and that kind of thing. So we just sort of encourage that as another body of work that can be brought into this conversation. The next piece looks at kind of the value of comparative analysis and builds a little bit off of what I was just saying. And I know that the paper talks a little bit about the EU and the UK and kind of acknowledges we have different political structures, and there's no doubt about that. But that doesn't mean that we can't learn from particular experiences and try to draw aspects or components of what has been done in other agencies in other countries into the thinking here. And I will say I'm particularly partial to this because 15 years ago I was a PhD student sitting in the UK trying to do a comparative study of net neutrality regulation in the US and the UK. And so I spent a lot of time analyzing decisions and decision-making processes at Ofcom in the UK and at the FCC in the US. Spoke to many, many people who worked in both broadband industries and in both regulators. And one thing that you just couldn't avoid noticing was that the UK had beautiful broadband maps. Just beautiful. I mean, beautifully presented, incredibly comprehensive data. And you could tell that Ofcom was able to use this as an evidentiary basis to carry forward its regulatory mandate. And at that time, and again, this is ancient times of 15 years ago, nobody trusted the FCC broadband maps at all because everybody knew that the data collection that was being used to inform them was really substandard. And so again, while these two agencies operate in different political regimes, there was one to me that seemed, in terms of its kind of research, evidentiary gathering function, very sophisticated, very sort of technocratically adept in terms of its data gathering. And that's, I think, something to learn from, no matter what shape we think this the digital regulator might take, which is that in order to be able to make proposals, imagine the world where you could make an apolitical net neutrality regulatory proposal. Wouldn't you want it to be based on data that all the stakeholders around the table felt like was sufficient to at least put that forward as a regulator? And I would sort of hold that up as a standard that we would want to achieve with a new digital regulator, even though we might have to get there a different way because we have a different political system. I will say, and it's not just because I lived in the UK, I'm quite partial to the UK regulators. Like, it's not just Ofcom, but the Competition and Markets Authority. Like, who gets a better education from the market studies that the CMA publishes? Nobody. Nobody publishes better market studies than the CMA. And I would not throw too much shade on the coordination activity that happens in the UK either. Through this Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum that brings Ofcom and the CMA together with the ICO and the Financial Regulatory Authority specifically to coordinate on digital issues. So I think, if none of this ever comes to pass, why can't we at least have that? Wouldn't that be nice? Like, to have just the digital parts of the agencies that do exist have a formal mechanism by which they coordinate and share expertise. Again, like none of this is perfect. I can talk to you all day long about how I think the privacy issues in the competition studies in the UK are not being properly addressed. But at least that mechanism is there to try to create some of that, that coordination. So that's one bit on the value of comparative analysis. I'll spend a moment on the European Union because it's been invoked many times. Obviously, it looms large in today's debates. So what do we see with the European Commission? The European Commission now is both the enforcers of the digital regulatory portfolio, and it's the political leadership of the Union. And that creates inherent questions about what happens when the objectives of rigorous enforcement do not perfectly align with the political or diplomatic objectives of the body. And the recent discussions about tariffs show this every single day, how this tension is sort of casting a shadow over the legitimate enforcement activity that European law mandates that the Commission has to engage in. And what it does is it creates a situation where it becomes advantageous for anyone who views themselves as being adversarial towards the European Union to link those two things together as much as possible, even though they should be separate, even though there's separate divisions of the Commission that are working on these things, right? Anyone who wants to use a political dispute with the European Union as a chit in the battle over the enforcement of the regulations will do so, and that's what we're seeing play out. So I think that's just again a really good lesson that we're going to be sitting with and living with for quite some time, and we can figure out what do we learn from that in this as we think about this question of political independence. The other note that I would lean on to learn from the European Union relates to the Joint Research Center. That was created as a Directorate General inside the European Commission, which is specifically formed to provide scientific evidence and research in support of policymaking in the European Union. And I don't really think anything like this exists. That's like an analog in the United States. But it's a nice model to look at. I mean, I personally would love to learn more about it myself. I've met a few of the researchers who work there. But two things I know about it is one, that it allows the researchers who work for the Commission to collaborate with external researchers and kind of foster research agendas and think about what else we can be developing and looking at jointly and separately that relates specifically to the policy objectives of the Union. And they do things like purchase data sets and do some of their own analysis. So interesting model to look at. And just coming back a little bit to the algorithmic piece and the content moderation, within it there's the European Center for Algorithmic Transparency, ECAT, which is specifically there to support internal research efforts that contribute to the enforcement of the Digital Services Act. So it's sort of like we already had this division, and then when we got a new law, we were able to stand up a new section of this division specifically to support the implementation of this law. So another interesting model to look at. Third piece, I'm going to talk a little bit about just sources of inspiration that I think would allow us to get more specific about the capacities of this potential new regulator could have. And the first one is a little bit of Georgetown horn tooting. There's this great project out of Georgetown Law called Redesigning the Governance Stack, led by Paul Ohm, Julie Cohen, and Meg Jones. And that's literally as ambitious as it is, like redesign the entire administrative state, specifically thinking about how we govern technology and technology companies. So it has a lot of, I think, similarity in terms of its objectives to this work that PK is doing. I won't bore you too much with the details of the project, but it has 4 pillars. And the first pillar was about regulatory monitoring. So you can go search for this on your favorite non-Google search engine, and you can find their website where they've already published this paper about regulatory monitoring. And they go into a ton of detail about specifically what kind of data should a potential new agency be able to access, how it should be able to do black box testing within the platforms, what kinds of experimental access the government or the administrative state needs to be able to have in order to check whether what the platforms are saying is actually true and to run their own kinds of experimentation. They talk about inspections and audits and requests for information and expanding FTC 6B style authority. So lots of really concrete ideas in there that I think would resonate quite a lot with what we're talking about. The second source of inspiration for me, it's been a huge source of inspiration for me, I would point folks toward the work of Gemma Petrie, who's a researcher at Mozilla, who has done really, I think, very unique work, both on the research side, she's a user experience researcher, but also articulating what does it mean to incorporate everything we know from user experience research into regulation. So she talks a lot about market testing, i.e. if you're going to have an intervention that requires a platform to change an interface, offer a choice, stop engaging in deceptive patterns, these kinds of things, that with the oversight of the agency, you would actually test it in the market first, and the platform would be required to demonstrate its effectiveness before it can be deployed. And this could take many different forms. It could, look at kind of experimentation, concept testing, usability testing. She gave a talk at a conference we did earlier this year called DMA and Beyond, and I would commend her slides and her presentation to you. And then the last one in this section I will note, which is probably familiar to many of you, but I can't have this sources of inspiration without noting the work of Lauren Willis on performance-based regulation, where we would sort of flip the paradigm and say, instead of telling companies from a behavioral perspective what they have to do, we're going to tell them the outcome we're going to measure. If 80% of people don't understand the choice you're offering, then you're not in compliance, and we're going to establish how those things get measured over time. And we're going to use the outcome as the measure of whether companies are complying and not the behavioral directive. Again, if we're in blue sky thinking, I would love to see more of those ideas get rolled into a potential paradigm for this regulator. So I'll finish up just with a couple of notes on the present moment and kind of bring us back around to a few of the things that other folks have talked about. On AI, I will just agree with really what the paper says and what other folks have spoken about. To me, like thinking about regulating AI is like regulating math. It doesn't make any sense. Nobody would ever propose it, so I don't really know why we propose it as like one giant general category in any context. But what we do have are laws and existing mechanisms that apply to products and markets that we know how to use, that states know how to use, that civil litigants know how to use, and that ranges across antitrust, consumer protection, torts. So let's use those. Let's stop thinking about how do we regulate math and start thinking about how do we use existing laws to address the harms that consumers and citizens are experiencing. And then my last point on here is sort of tying it all the way back to some of what Kathleen was talking about at the beginning related to the Google search case. We did a bunch of work last year kind of analyzing potential remedies in the Google search antitrust case. And one of the interesting things that came out of that was, we sort of envisioned the notion of a technical committee similar to what we had in the Microsoft case. And as we went through and started making the list of all the responsibilities that this technical committee might need in order to provide effective oversight of Google in the marketplace, it started to kind of look like a regulator because it, to effectively oversee the imposition of remedies in that case, you're going to need a lot of different capacities. You're going to have to solicit input from a broad array of stakeholders. You're going to have to design privacy interventions. You're going to have to oversee line of business restrictions. You have to adjudicate complaints when other market actors come to you and say, hey, they're not supposed to be self-preferencing, but they clearly are. And so that's the difference with the AT&T case, is that regulator isn't there. In the present moment, I think we all do need to think creatively about what we can do instead. And so it might be that technical committees created by courts are the tool that we have at our disposal now. But to the extent that there's any good ideas that we've thought about, hey, that would have worked with the regulator, can we use it in some context that's a result of this litigation? I think we should all be doing that, and that would be a helpful way to kind of bridge the gap between where we are now, the time it's going to take to develop the political will for a regulator, and the tools that we have at our disposal today.
Thank you, Alissa. Everybody need a deep breath now? Right, that was, so we had a keynote on antitrust, we had Harold's presentation. I know we've had close to an hour of considered responses to this PK report. And my job is to both engage perhaps Howard in some first thoughts he has in response to the respondents, but also perhaps to get these four to engage and then also to engage with you. And Meredith, how much time do we have for that at this point? Not much. Yeah? Maybe 15, 20 minutes, something like that? Okay. So let's start there. Maybe Harold, you've been taking lots of notes over here, dutifully standing, waiting to say a word. Any points of response to the panel here?
Well, clearly I picked the right panel. There's a lot of very good stuff here. I get just one or two quick thoughts, which started with the last person, which was Alissa. The problem is a lot of the research you're talking about is locked up in proprietary databases with subscriptions that cost a lot more than we can afford at PK. So if you don't mind us sneaking in,
You should partner with your favorite local research organization.
Because I think you're absolutely right. And everybody who raised the point of various cross-disciplinary, cross-intersection is exactly right. It was certainly one of the things we hope to get out of surveying the field and bringing together experts from a variety of different backgrounds was exactly because there's so much here that is at cross intersection with other things, and trying to figure out how to handle that and not be paralyzed was indeed part of the challenge. I will say that it was interesting to me because one of the things that I had not considered or started considering here is when the last agency we created, the CFPB, was actually breaking functions out of other agencies to bring them all together in one place because the consumer protection functions were being neglected in these other agencies that were focused on other things. So the point that was made by a number of you that we need to, one, expand, still will not get out of expanding the power of existing agencies to deal with the pieces that would fall between the cracks in a DPC, but also that this is something of a reverse problem of, we need to enhance the ability to coordinate these areas of intersection so that everybody is not stepping on each other's toes, but also is properly focused on the consumer protection and competition elements. I think the rest I will leave us to general conversation because there's a lot of good stuff here to think about, so thank you all.
So knowing we only have a few minutes to get some questions from the audience as well, I'm going to pose just one question that was on my mind and listening to all of you talk and thinking about some of the comments that you made earlier, which is just around the time dimension of regulation and addressing these harms. I mean, you brought up the fact that essentially Google has been operating outside of the law for how long now? An enormous amount of time. I remember I was sitting on a panel last week with a former Google employee and thinking, this person's talking about the things they did in their career, et cetera. They did all of that outside of the law. They, ate all of those meals in the company cafeteria, essentially, operating outside of the law. Right. So if we think about the time dimension on all of this report in the Wall Street Journal yesterday about Meta AI chatbots engaging children in sexual conversation. Gosh, it's just the time dimension here. We've wasted, by some measure, a lot of time. Do we feel we're, this commission perhaps, or some of the conversations we had today, could that help on this time problem? Anybody would like to take that?
Yeah, I think it was tricky because we're imagining this new agency in a future where we have a reformed Congress and reformed courts and we're fighting to get our systems back. But I was thinking about the FDA, obviously when I was preparing for this, and one big difference between the FDA and where we are at now is that the states have not started regulating drug approvals when the FDA was formed. So you didn't have a big preemption debate. It was very clear, the FDA is going to approve drugs, a state cannot unapprove the drug. Now, over time, states have figured out ways to adjust the market for certain drugs when they want to, but it happened in that order. And we're very clearly not happening in that order. So one thing I didn't get to include in my remarks, but I think kind of speaks to this time thing, is that some of this stuff is going to end up in international standards bodies, and I just wrote a piece on this. But we're already seeing, obviously, both the EU laws pushing international standards, and then we're seeing states starting to reference those standards, and I think they are realizing that they are going to have to start working together. We just saw the 9 states say they're going to work together on privacy. I think we're going to see them start to understand they have to work together to engage in these international standards. But I feel like once you can get that landscape working, to your point, as new harms kind of emerge, it's kind of taking a tool that's already there, risk assessments and independent audits, and then just shaping them a little bit. But we're not quite there. But I think the ChatGPT example is a really good one in the sense that we have thought about youth online and interacting with harmful players. So now it's just like putting that to work in this space.
Yeah, I think there's a couple other aspects that get lost when you only focus on like when did it start and then when did the remedy actually get imposed. Which is not to say that antitrust isn't slow, because it definitely feels that way. But one is just like the downstream impact of those remedies on the entire industry once the court case has been through, right? And I think, again, that's probably a place where there's some good empirical analysis that I'm not an expert on. But I hear this about the patent provisions in the IBM case that opened whole new industries, right? People will say that like Google could only grow because the Microsoft case was decided the way that it was. Kathleen noted that there is yet to be another case against Microsoft, or maybe there's one in the works, right? But I don't think that's like an accident. So there's other effects that occur even if in the industry, like while litigation is happening or afterward, that are meaningful. The other thing that I'll just say is, and maybe people don't realize this, that the DMA in some ways represents the accrual of all the learnings of the litigation. So the Google search case in the EU took even longer than the case here, self-preferencing, and at some point, folks got together and said, we're gonna bundle up all of these things that we've learned and put them into a regulation. And that's actually, so we're having like a real-time test of how is that gonna work and whether it's gonna work, but that's like specifically the design to say, we're gonna flip this over from ex post to ex ante and use everything we learned in the ex post world to inform what we do ex ante.
Anybody else on this one? Or anything that you'd like to say in response to each other? Anything to add in? Prem's thinking about it.
I just want to add one thought, because I am a big supporter of the transparency and the risk assessment. I'm waiting to see how risk assessment works in this area from the EU, because the concern is that the regulated entity comes back and says everything's great, and we have a lot of issues. I am nervous about whether the kind of performance-based regulation that you're talking about would be sustained in the United States under administrative law, or whether it would be, I'm thinking the usual complaints of regulated entities is, gosh, we don't know what to do. You're not giving us enough clarity. Oh, you're giving us too much clarity. You're too controlling. There's a whole bunch of issues that unfortunately are political economy, which I think are somewhat different in other countries where there is a more, when I say corporatist, I mean a sort of general idea that everybody gets together and there is more expectation of a negotiated good faith outcome than here in the United States, where it's very adversarial and where I think the FDA is an example of an industry where things worked out because of the long history of regulation in that space. And that people came with an expectation And that expectation has been slow to fade, as opposed to in other industries where that expectation may have existed at one point, but has really faded completely away. So I worry somewhat about that. I worry about to what extent we can have genuine transparency. My experience at the FCC is that everybody claims everything is proprietary information. And in fact, once they invented a separate category of super secret proprietary information, which required even more limitations, then everybody claims that everything is super secret proprietary information. And we don't even have them bothering to claim proprietary information anymore. So I would like to see some of these things and see if we can make them stick. I am nervous about them in this particular environment unless we have courts that are willing to come down with a big, heavy sledgehammer very early on and say, no malicious compliance, no fakery. If you want to do this and not get broken up, it has to be real.
Okay, just a couple of hands in the room if anybody has a question. Okay, we've got one there in the back and then one up here at the front first. Yes, sir.
Andy Schwartzman from the Benton Institute for Broadband and Society. I realize this is a terrific aspirational proposal where some of the issues here are whether the Federal Trade Commission might be better qualified or another independent agency might be better qualified to do this. And in light of that, I'd like to read a sentence from a political story that moved after this panel started. It says that the House Reconciliation Bill draft frees up funding to transfer all Federal Trade Commission antitrust actions and employees to the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice, effectively kneecapping the core FTC regulatory power. I'm curious what the panel thinks this portends.
Well, I think we recognize the environment we're in, where we have a chief, that song some of us learned from Schoolhouse Rock, No More King, seems to have aged rather poorly in this administration. And this is a piece of that. And we will see if that actually succeeds. One hopes that it does not. But if anything, it underscores the need for to fight as hard as possible for institutionalized independence. It's going to be rough. But, it's again, if I only did things that people told me were possible and I didn't try things that people told me were impossible, I'd never get anything done.
We had another one here in the front.
Hi, my name's Ann Froome. I'm just in the private sector. I had a question about a little more specificity about what you're proposing to regulate. And the reason I'm asking that is I heard your clear statement, Harold, that it was digital platforms within the specifications you provided. But then I heard the group talking about regulating digital services, and then I heard another panelist talking about regulating digital technology companies, not even digital, technology companies. So what is it, who will be this agency's group that they're regulating?
Right. Well, as I say, I think that is part of what we're debating here, where our starting position in our proposals, we have a very clear idea of the companies involved, where we are talking about those that have a public-facing and a enterprise or non-public facing, where the platform is capable of controlling all the information that is available on one side, where the interactions not just between both sides of the platform, but horizontally on each side of the platform provide particularly powerful network effects which make competition without assistance extraordinarily difficult. People have different views at this point, and this is a fair debate to have. I think that everybody here on the panel has a somewhat different conception of, if they had the pen, what they would use as the statutory definition. And I think that's fair, and part of this process is to try to come to a consensus over what should be in, what should be out, and where the corner cases are going to be.
Thank you.
I saw Mark's hand just next, and I'm afraid maybe I'll get yours out, get your question out as well. But Mark, we're both on this, so I'm gonna.
You're not going to skip Gigi.
And
And
then
I'm not.
Gigi as well.
That's right, Harold wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for me.
Oh,
That's great.
So yeah, go buy my book. It's regulating digital industries, and inspired by Harold's first piece in 2019. This is a great panel. Thank you all very much for putting this together. I want to put the AI issue on the table and see what people can say about that. I think, Alissa, you put your finger on it. Are you really regulating math when you talk about regulating AI? I know people distinguish between models and products and services, and they say regulate one but not the other. How would the Digital Platform Commission relate to all this? I mean, does it name a bunch of services and say chatbots, we regulate them? How does it focus on the AI issues? And I'd love to hear other people on the panel as well address Alyssa's point about you can't regulate math.
Okay, so we've got the question about AI, which the paper does say was the point of greatest contention, the least consensus in all of your discussion. But Gigi, you want to get your question?
I think Mark's question is much better than mine, so I'd like to hear the response
Okay,
myself.
all right. AI.
It's a good question. I do think I'll reiterate what I said, and I will second what Alissa said, which is I think talking about regulating AI in the abstract is falling into a much worse and more intractable definitional problem than trying to align on what a digital platform should be and therefore what's within the scope of the DPC. And I think separating out the core rights-based concerns remains, to me, the most sensible way to think about regulating AI and thinking about the tools that are available and potential additional tools we might need. But thinking about privacy implications, thinking about transparency issues, thinking about fairness and sort of disparity in power between those running an algorithm and those who are subject to its effects, I think those are the most effective ways to think about it. Some of which overlay with the DPC as Harold and Alissa propose it, to the extent that they are sort of digital platform integrated AIs, and some of which fall outside it. And so my main point was just don't lose sight of that which falls without, because it's very easy, I think, to see an ambitious new regulator on the block with a title like this, with a subtitle like building a better, big tech mousetrap, and conclude we've got most of the power dynamic issues covered. And so that, I'm partially answering your question, I think, but maybe not entirely.
I'm just going to add one of the more important early papers on the internet was something called Digital Tornado by Kevin Wehrbach. And that was not an exercise of the FCC in regulation. It was an exercise of the FCC as an expert agency performing an almost think tank-like function, taking a look at matters within its jurisdiction and the development of a new technology and trying to say, okay, folks, people who are not thinking about this or who are perhaps only thinking about it in terms of AOL chat rooms need to understand that this is a world-changing technology, and that even to call it just a technology rather than a suite of protocols and that ride on networks is to understate it. I think that the DPC should certainly play a similar function with regard to the use of artificial intelligence in various industry settings. I think that if we're looking at questions, I mean, PK does a lot of work in AI, and we have a lot of different ways that we look at it. Intellectual property is something that comes up a lot, and I don't think DPC ought to be an intellectual property regulating entity. Clearly we're going to have to resolve in some way the arguments that are going on right now about the use of copyrighted material in large language models and all of these other things that folks are very aggressively arguing about. But it's a thing that a digital platform commission would have to understand, whatever the rule is, and understand what behavior that creates or doesn't create within the digital platform space as people want to use AI for a variety of purposes. So I think that this is an area where in some cases it will be very obvious that this is not any different than the algorithms you were using 5 years ago when we were talking about this, and therefore it doesn't change the equation. But there will be other places where the role will be as an expert and as a attempt to forecast issues rather than as a direct regulator.
Ramesh, sorry, you had the mic, I thought, but may have handed it over to Anna. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just run this note. We can't regulate math, but we can regulate data, and we can regulate systems. And I'll just point to the EU. The EU tried to separate AI and social media with the DSA and the AI Act. And if you look at the risk assessments coming out of the Digital Services Act, they reference the AI risk management frameworks because social media is a set of AI systems. The more you try to parse these things out, they are going to run into each other. So I think centering around core competencies, deep expertise in the infrastructure, the protocols, the API, and then centering around how do we do risk assessment well, auditing well, transparency, researcher access well, and being able to be nimble within those tools, which I understand are challenging and agree, and FDA has struggled and the financial industry has struggled with audits. We have to learn from those spaces. But the less we can define subsets, I think the better.
I think we are out of time, but I have one last question I have to ask. Knowing that this came out of the public knowledge policy conclave, if in fact there is a digital platform commission established at some point in the United States, what color smoke will emanate from it? Given that some thought. I waited at the end to make a conclave joke, but that wasn't bad. Anyways, Michelle, would you like to say a word to conclude us? Let's thank Harold. Let's thank Alissa for the public knowledge.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Justin, for moderating today. Thank you to all of our panelists. A great dynamic conversation. I am hopeful that today's dialogue inspires a shared commitment to building a digital future that is better, fairer, and more accountable. This report and the broader initiative is just the beginning. The public knowledge team is continuing to work on this, and we're committed to keeping the conversations inclusive, imaginative, and grounded in the public interest. Once again, I want to thank our host, General Block, our keynote speaker, Nagarajan, and Justin Hendrix for great moderation, and our incredible panelists. I also want to acknowledge once more Harold Feld and the rest of the public knowledge team for their work leading up to today and beyond.